Good afternoon. I'm Casey Karges. I'm the Executive Director of the Mediation Center. We're one of 6 mediation centers. We're a nonprofit, one of 6 centers across the state. We're in our 25th year. Legislation was passed that established mediation centers to deal with all kinds of conflict. And today we're going to talk about how dealing with difficult conversations and the advantages of doing that. At the Mediation Center, you may get to us in a variety of ways. About 50% of the time, you might be court ordered to walk in our doors and we'll shake your hand and take your money anyway. 50% of the time, organizations, people, relationships come and use the Mediation Center to kind of help dealing with conflict. And so, but today's, what we're going to do is talking about dealing with difficult conversations, and we're going to help you plan for your conversations. So we're going to start out with the understanding we all have conflict. Conflict is not bad. Conflict can create very important change, and so conflict is not a bad thing. I think each one of us in our own way want to come up with how can we be effective in how we deal with conflict. And so today that's what we're going to do. First we're going to talk about, when I say conflict, what first comes to mind? I want you to lift up words. Conflict, what first comes to mind?
Fight.
What's that?
Fight.
Fight.
Anger.
Anger.
Bad feelings.
Bad feelings.
Frustration.
Frustration. Stress.
Stress. Yeah.
Stress.
Anger.
Anger. Disagree.
Sound effects. Yeah. Say helpless.
Helpless.
Out of control.
Out of control. Are you catching a theme here? All this is bad. As you know, within your work setting, dealing within your relationships, doesn't have to be. And so, how can we create the tools, a comfort level, an awareness of what's going on when conflict happens, and so we can deal with it in an effective way that we feel good about ourselves. And what's really interesting in a town like Lincoln is that a lot of times with conflict, you might be someplace where you would be in conflict, you would handle it in a way knowing I will never see that person again. Around here, you have conflict, you're going to work with those people again. And so how do you go about trying to do those things in a way that you feel good? So here's what we know. Dave teaches at the law school, so he'll do all my research stuff for me. But we know basically within our brains, our immediate response is, you'll talk about fight or flight, and then they've gone on to say freeze or surrender. So we know our immediate response in our brains, we have things that we do when things go wrong. We get angry, we get upset, we get stressed, and what we're going to talk about is each of us probably has learned a natural way for us for an immediate response. So part of it is understanding who we are and how we handle that. Now, I have communicators in the room. This is no news to you. We know the percentages that are up there. 7% of communication is words. So what's scary is I have a 22-year-old daughter. Guess how she communicates? She texts everything. It's really a challenge to have a conversation with her because she's used to communicating. And now, do know she's a drama major. She's really good at communicating. But, I mean, you know, in dealing with, you know, we'll work with conflict, and she's very comfortable, like today. We were texting on particular issues. Then it's the tone of our voice. That 38% is that the tone of the voice, you can read with someone what they're really meaning through the tone. And then it's body language, all of this visual stuff. And the one I like is that I get the opportunity to do a lot of public speaking, and it's the 125 words a minute. We can talk about 125 words per minute. We can think at 500. So I'm up here talking to you, thinking about my basketball bracket, saying, you know, who am I going to put in? And when we're focusing in conflict or we're working with someone else, how do we move all of that brain energy into actually working and being present with the people that we're working with? And so we work on the message that is intended, the message that's sent, and then ultimately the message is understood. That's a big chasm that we want to be great at. Not only in working within our businesses, but within the relationships within our offices and our relationships that are the most important to us. So for us, it's that difference between what we see and what is interpreted and what is heard. What I think and feel. Do know a lot of, we do what's called a mediated process at the Mediation Center, and a lot of it is an awareness of, we may be working on a particular issue. We bring to that issue an awful lot. And so when working with someone else to have an understanding they're doing the same thing. And getting under that thinking and feeling to prepare. So different perspectives. One thinks this is a triangle. One thinks it's a rectangle. One thinks it's a square. The mice are seeing it at a different angle. So when we're preparing to have a difficult conversation is how do we go into the conversation in our mind to say what are those different perspectives? So we want to do this because we know conversations can go bad. That is a wrecked ship, and we don't want that to happen. And so the cost of conflict within your business, waste of time, opportunity, morale, creativity, conflict-induced problems continue. You have been in those meetings, you have worked with those employees, that when you walk in the door, it's stress. Is there a way to deal with it to turn the corner so you won't see some of the high conflict cost of working around a problem? So a lot of times when we're working with a problem, we want it to go away. And so we start working on, I really don't need to address this. It's not that important. We avoid conflict. We realize that things need to be addressed, but we think, oh my gosh, it's better to avoid it, and it just builds to the point we start thinking, do I want to be here? Or do I want to be in this relationship? We teach classes, parents who go through custody issues, we have to teach a class. And one of my favorite slides is that when you're first in a relationship, they talk about positive intimacy. In positive intimacy, when you're with someone else, it feels like everything they do is for and because of you. Positive intimacy. There are a few people that shift into what we call negative intimacy. The line I always use is when the other person breathes, it feels like they're doing it just to tick you off. And so that's not just in relationships in couples, it's in relationships in business as well. When the other person walks in the room, you are tensed by their body language. They don't even have to say something. And when you're in negative intimacy, the brain goes to the point that when they say something, you probably don't even hear it because it's coming from them. And then the creativity goes away, and in your business, when that starts to happen, solutions, working together, all that becomes more difficult. You're not as good as you want to be because we don't allow that to happen. So this is one of Dave's, I appreciate he brings this Kilman-Thomas scale. It is an awareness that we handle conflict differently. So an example would be over here is the importance of the relationship. Up here is the importance of the task or goal. Do you have anybody in your life that the first thing that happens when conflict happens, they accommodate? Any accommodators here? Nobody? My mom is the best accommodator on the face of the planet. She will take in half the homeless population just because there's an issue in hand, and her first response is she's going to do everything possible. And she's fantastic. She'll do anything possible to accommodate a need. There are some people whose brains immediately go to that. Some people avoid. I know we have none of those in here, none of those in your relationships. People's a natural response when conflict happens, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to wait as long as I can, and it's going to go away. Then we have those who probably move more towards the advocacy, where the task or goal is more important than the relationship. Anybody see Bo Pelini on the sideline in the midst of a football game? You could see his brain when conflict happened, his first response was out. You just see it click. And people that are just like it. Now, do know that there are effective times for that to happen, and people can be really good at it, and yet long-term relationships don't happen when you continue to do that. And then, a lot of times when we think of conflict resolution styles, we think of compromise. We're going to meet in the middle. You're going to buy a car, you're $2,000 off. I'm going to tell you, you're probably going to meet in the middle, it'll be another $1,000. There's times that 50-50 works. There are times that that's not the best solution. So a lot of times we are working towards more of a collaborative. In mediation, we'll talk about an interest-based model where we're trying to find what are your interests, what are the interests of the people where you're having conflict. Is there a way for people to have enough of their interests met? Where they might say, you know, it's not a best case scenario, but I'm getting enough of my interests met that I'm willing to collaborate to make this work. So what we know is that we have ways that we lean towards each one of those, but every one of those is an effective way to deal with conflict at an appropriate time. And for us to learn, this is an appropriate time. I'm going to lean towards something I'm not used to doing, but I'm going to do this in the moment because I feel it's appropriate. And so when we deal with conflict, not only within our work, but maybe within things that are very important to us in society today, you might be finding yourself leaning towards an area where you're not comfortable, and yet you're willing to do it because you're going to make a decision because you want to deal with the conflict, you want to do it differently than you have in the past. So that's the Kilman-Thomas. And so we care so much about conflict because it's really important to us, our work, and our relationship. And what we know, as I was talking earlier, is the brain gets to the point when you're feeling conflicted, you move to the less complex. You're not able to function like you want to function and be creative because the brain doesn't allow you to do so because conflict is taking place. We have an attorney in Omaha that runs what's called the Conciliation Court, and he has this in his office. It is the two Chinese symbols for conflict. And it's a combination of danger and opportunity. And so today we want to emphasize is an awareness of the danger and also the awareness of when conflict happens. Oh my gosh, it's an opportunity for wonderful things that can happen. So I'm going to ask Dave, as we're going to shift some microphones here to keep going.
So you think of this conflict of satisfaction. The thing that precedes this is the conflict triangle, which is, on the bottom you have the problem that needs to be addressed, that may or may not be addressed the way you'd like it to be. On this other side of the triangle, you have the people side of things, and then you have the process side. And so problems typically have to have all three components addressed. And this is just that visual representation that in the middle of a lot of stuff are usually these things called interests. And so to deal with conflict in a satisfactory way, we try and address the substantive problem. We try and address the psychological needs that people have, as well as the procedural needs, because we all have that internal fairness meter that's running, and we want something that's fair. So you might recognize Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One of the things that's not on here, but should be down here towards the bottom somewhere is just understanding and being understood. And that's where we do a lot of our work, is helping people understand one another and having a person be, feel heard and understood by at least the mediator. So this idea of, we think it's helpful to have a plan for navigating difficult conversations. We came up with this over a decade ago, but it's the idea of prepare, launch, attend, and negotiate. It's just a model of how do you keep all this stuff straight. There's all these ways of, communication is important. You've got the importance of listening, the relationship, the people side of it, being respectful. How do you keep all this stuff straight? And so we had a request from a business entity here in Lincoln, and they wanted to train their upper level managers and supervisors in mediator skills, but they didn't want to put them through a formal training, but they wanted to give them a kind of a way to do mediation and use mediation-like skills in dealing with the people that they were managing and supervising. So we came up with this idea of a plan, and the first component of it was to prepare, because the very first, as you guys know, the most important part of all this communication is preparing yourself for the interaction. So, what happens most of the time is when we just sort of react with our primitive cave person response. You know, we're going with our gut. And has anybody seen any of the Dave Chappelle When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong? Okay, a couple people have seen those. If you want to see a good, reaction, more primitive response, just Dave Chappelle When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong, but don't watch it around your kids, because I showed it to some people last night and I forgot how much swearing. Oh my gosh. I can see why some people really don't like that. But the idea is we're hardwired to react. And that's what kept our primitive ancestors alive. So we are here thanks to this hardwiring, this primitive lizard brain, the amygdala hijack, that rather than think about, I wonder if that tiger is dangerous or not, or that rustling in the grass. I see a lot of grass moving around. That's why, language developed later, because the visual and the auditory parts were so important. And so prepare is just a reminder for us to avoid assuming, for us to stay curious and think through whatever the problem is that we think we want to address, and give some thought to it and make a decision. Is this a conversation that we should have, or a negotiation, or not have? Is there some way of working around it? The launch is just to get off to a good start, because we know when you get off to a good start, chances are you're going to have a better ending. So pretty simple there. Then we had this part called attend. And attend was this idea, we used to call it think like a mediator. But when I started doing this, rolling out this plan for parent education, it kind of dawned on me, late I'll say, but it did eventually come to me. We learn the majority of these skills by the time we graduate from kindergarten. Now, you guys probably all learned them better because you're one of the most intimidating groups to talk to, because you're professional communicators. But the only group that's worse in my mind is the brain scientists, because we will talk about how the brain works and stuff. And when you're talking to brain scientists about that, it's like, okay, I mispronounced whatever it was, or the prefrontal cortex is really whatever. But you get it, that the attending piece is about being respectful, using your indoor voice, taking turns. And there's things like you want to ask respectful questions, and you want to do those kinds of things. You can summarize. And if you really get good at attending, you might do things like reframing. And I had a parent education last night, and my easiest demonstration for parents of a reframe is, if you find yourself talking to the other parent about visitation, stop it. Because visitation is a terrible frame for what could be called simply parenting time. And you can have a much better conversation about talking about parenting time than visitation. Visitation just sounds like, I don't know, just sounds bad. But you guys get what reframing is, you're professionals at it, so that skill would come very naturally to you. But the bottom line of all this is that all these conversations are always a negotiation. And how many of you think of yourselves as professional negotiators? People's hands don't go up. It's universal, so don't feel bad. But you are a negotiator. You're a professional negotiator. You're doing it all the time, every day. So we might as well get better at the negotiation piece and just keep that in mind. And we'll go through those basic steps. So the idea of preparing for better communication, you want to have an understanding of your own emotions, your own perceptions, your own feelings about things. You want to try and understand the other, and you want to try and understand how that dynamic plays out between the two of you. And if you go to the TKI Instrument or Thomas Kilmann Institute, you can pay like $35 and you can get a 13, 14-page report that kind of gives you a little bit of information about your style and your dominant. I think most of you, I'm just guessing, would, on average, there's probably the majority of people fall into, for a lot of things, what I call the executive avoiding category on things, because it'll just get better. If I just ignore it, it will go away. It's got to take care of itself. You're 90% of the time, you can ignore it, and it does get better. But what do you do about the things when you ignore, and they don't get better. So you want to prepare yourself so you can avoid reacting. Again, we're reaction machines. That's going to happen. We're going to get triggered. Somebody does something, and we are hardwired for that amygdala hijack to immediately take over, and the blood flow will increase to our extremities, prepare us for that fight or flight.
Okay, just an image I use, and the conflict starting to happen. Everybody knows the Muppets. Everybody knows the Muppets. The guys bitching up in the balcony all the time. When you're in the midst of conflict, think about, I'm going to go up into the balcony. And you're trying to get, when we're working with a business, in some way we're trying to get a perspective that is different than the one that you have right now. And up in the balcony, you're trying to look down on, okay, what's going on in the conflict? So you're asking your question, what's really happening, and try to be true with yourself, what's really happening. And then ask yourself, how am I going to share this, and then how are they going to respond? What's different is that you might have interests different from them. And when I went through the whole mediation training stuff, what was so helpful for me is that I realized, okay, I have an interest in the conflict that's happening at this moment, and their interest is different from mine. And if I got my best case scenario, it's probably not going to be great for them. And so I'm really asking them to do something that's better for me than that. That was helpful for me, because in some way what I was doing is I was going up into the balcony, and I was looking down the situation. Okay, how am I sharing? How are they going to respond? So I'm preparing myself to decide if I want to have this conversation. And in some way, I'm saying, okay, how are they going to what are they going to ask for? And how am I going to respond? And so it's taking ourselves up, it's taking a moment, taking a breath, looking at the situation to see what's going on with the other person. Dave, do the Batna, Patna, do that one.
The idea of Batna, Patna, Watna
Okay.
is just, you want to always have a plan B in your back pocket whenever you're negotiating. And so your plan B is your alternative. So BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What would be, if you settled this out of this realm. PATNA is the probable, statistically you kind of calculate the odds and think what the most likely would be. And then the WATNA is the worst alternative. And if you're aware of those bookends, that can help you stay engaged in the moment, and it reminds you that it's worth the effort to have these conversations.
Thank you. Okay, the next one, I'll tell this story differently than anybody else. Actually, mediation, it was the early 70s. It was out of what's called the Harvard Project. There was a book called Getting to Yes, and Dave, the two writers were?
Roger Fisher and William Ury.
Fisher and Ury were the two, and this was the story that was kind of the key. You've heard it before. I'll tell it in a different way. Let's imagine two daughters are coming down for breakfast, and there's one orange on the table. And both daughters want the orange. What's going to happen? Mom comes in, the daughters are arguing. One wants the orange, the other one wants the orange. One's older, one got there beforehand, one needs the orange more, and the conflict is continuing. The mom then starts asking the questions. Why do you want the orange? Realizing, one daughter, oh my gosh, I want the orange for the peel because I want to cook, and I want to use the peel for the cooking. The other daughter wanted the orange for the juice, to make some orange juice. She wanted the middle. By the mom asking some simple questions of what were their interests, in some way both daughters were able to get what they wanted because the mom was using some of those mediator skills to kind of investigate what's going on, what are your interests, is there a way to come up with a solution that both parties' interests are met in some way. So we're starting out with an awareness of ourselves and our own emotions, our ability to look from that up in the balcony perspective, for us to do an accurate assessment. What Dave was talking about is there are situations, you're in a difficult situation, you're going to evaluate, you know what, I don't have the time and the energy to deal with this. It's just going to be better for us to leave this go at the moment. Or you're going to determine, you know what, this is affecting me, it's affecting our workplace, I want to do this in an effective way, and you want to move forward and have self-confidence and be honest with yourself that this is something that you want to deal with. So we're going to begin with the prepare. What happened, the feelings, the identity, and the purpose is that we are starting to prepare, and this is one of those, what do you see? Duck? Rabbit. Yeah, it depends on your perspective on what you're going to see. So I asked Dave to put this in. You probably have seen this before. And this is not a new thing, but I like to show this every time because showing our perspectives. And Dave, do you want to set it up at all, or does the guy set it up in the...
Yeah, well, he's gonna provide some instructions. If you've seen it before, just keep the answers to yourself. But he primes you to think about some things, and then it's just to pay really close attention.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
So usually, 50% of the people don't see the gorilla. That's amazing. So when you see an accident and somebody sees the accident and says what happens, and there's somebody else on the other side of the street that saw the same accident and described something differently, the brain can work that way. And so when we're working with someone else and we're having conflict, it's an awareness of, oh my gosh, they may be seeing this differently. And think of this video, that someone could miss a gorilla jumping around in the middle of an audience and someone not see it, because they're focused on something that was so different. So in part of this, we talk about the ladder of the inference. We move up. We start with a pool of information. And what we're trying to do as the great communicators that you want to be is that we want to gather as much of information as we can get, and we want to have that because it's just better for the more information. So we have our observations, our interpretations, our conclusions. And so we work up the ladder of inference, realizing someone's might be different. So if we have two friends that are getting together and they're having a meal together and they're having a conflict because, let's say, Jason and Jill, and Jason has a difficulty because there are dirty dishes left in the sink as they're sitting down to eat. And that is just driving him crazy. For Jill, Jason clears the table before I'm finished eating. She's sitting there eating, and he's worried about the dishes in the sink. So who's right here, Jason or Jill? So for Jason, it's unsanitary. Jill does it just to bug me. Noticing, moving somewhat in that negative intimacy, oh my gosh, she's just doing this it's against me. Jill, it ruins the meal to jump up and clear the table so quickly. Jason finally ends up, Jill is an uncaring pig, and Jason is a jerk who needs to lighten up. So, seeing things differently, what were important. The mediator, the third story, is where the judgment removed. You have a different preference about if the table is clean and the dishes are done. You're unhappy with each other's approach. Wouldn't you be willing to talk about this? You can do the same thing. Is there a way to work it out? Because our preferences might be different. And so in some way, we're trying to have a conversation by avoiding making the other person mad. Do know when you start having a difficult conversation, you can say something to the other person where the first thing you say, the conversation is over. I have couples come in and they will record their conversations that they had challenges with. They will record their arguments with their phone. And they'll put it down on the table. And here's what I found is, most often, the conversations that people record, the conversation was over in the first minute. There was nothing productive that's going to come out after a few words were said. The brain gets to the point where it's problem solving is over. And most often, the person who puts down the phone can't hear how they're arguing. they can only hear the screaming of the other party and think how offensive they are. Most often we miss out on what we're doing. And so in some way, when you begin a conversation, and that's why Dave's big on the prepare, how do we avoid creating an atmosphere? In some way, we're putting out an invitation to see if this conversation can happen in a productive ways. And so, Dave, I'm going to have you continue to work on the stop.
Okay, so this is just a little anger management type technique that you can use, STPA, just recognizing that we do have free will, recognizing that we are hardwired to just be reactionary. So STPA is just a little bit of our preparation that reminds us to stop and think. And we think long term, that can be helpful, but to pause and reflect on what's working and what hasn't, and then to either act or most of the time not act. Because sometimes not reacting is the most important thing that we can do. So you want to prepare by, knowing your triggers. What are your anger alleviators? What helps you? What do you do for self-care? Because you got to start off by taking care of yourself. That's one of the important parts about prep. So this whole idea of preparation is to get you ready to recognize that we assume. And at the law college, I have a nice big long whiteboard where I can write the ASS in one color, and then it's like, oh, the marker ran out of ink. Switch colors, right up the U. Oh, that one's dead too. And then finish off with me in a different color, and the students get it. Assuming is bad. And so the idea is we want to prepare ourselves so we stay curious. So we stay curious and can have a learning conversation by shifting to a learning stance. And if you want to read more about this, there's a great book that grew out of the Harvard Negotiation Project called Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most, and kind of has its own little model, but lots of good things. And then the idea is you want to launch into a learning conversation. And the launch is really fairly simple. It's just making a decision about getting beyond, because the tip of the iceberg, and I don't have the technological abilities to be able to stop this iceberg right there, but no, it just keeps climbing. But anyway, you get the idea that our interests, our motivations, our concerns, our needs are all this stuff that's hidden beneath the surface. Now it's motivating us. It's the fuel behind the fire of the conflict, so to speak. But where do we begin? We typically begin from our own story. So launches, first and foremost, are always going to be respectful, but we want to launch in a way that recognizes them and their interests in some fashion. So because we begin from our own truth, because we don't really listen, because we're too busy defending, typically, our own position, we trigger their defenses. And most of you in this room are too young to remember, but I grew up in the days of black and white television. This is the robot from Lost in Space. And the robot could sense danger. And almost every episode there'd be a, "Danger, Will Robinson, danger!" And you go, oh, cool, something's going to happen. And this idea is we want to avoid triggering their defenses.
Okay, that was embarrassing. We're working with a guy at the University of Minnesota, Mark Umbright. And Mark came in, and just hold on a second. Mark came in and he did a 3-day training for mediators on listening. 3 days. And here's his point. His point is we have learned active listening. We all know we know how to give back, we know how to give feedback, say what they say. Mark's big thing is to do listening where you just sit there. You don't have to say what they're saying. You don't have to come up with a story that relates to their story. He calls it deep listening. We did this for 3 days. Try it sometime. Because sometimes when people are starting to need to have you hear their story. They just want to talk. And so how we learn to listen sometimes to someone that just needs to be heard, if we really want to hear them, it's not, they don't need to hear a story that relates, because I do that a lot. I'm great at that. I love having conversations back and forth. But that meets my need. It might not meet their need. So if you really have someone that needs to be listened to, there's something new called deep listening. Not lube, but just reframe.
All right. So don't hold that against the Mediation Center, my imitation of the robot. But the thing we want to do with our launches is we want to recognize the importance of safety. Because if we don't feel safe, we are not going to share as human beings. So the idea of mutual respect, how do you demonstrate that? Do you need ground rules, guidelines for the conversation, a protocol of some kind, whatever? But also, what's the purpose? And so if we're dealing with an institution and we're doing strategic planning on how to improve climate collegiality in the culture, we might spend some time focusing on the vision and the mission and tying those things together better in strategic planning. You could use an I message. You guys get it? The facts or the feelings and then the facts. Got to say, as an attorney, I struggled with this for a long time. But I've gotten better. And I've expanded, from just feelings and facts to I talk about the behavior. Again, you've got to describe it at the bottom of the ladder of inference, not at the judgmental level, and the effect that it has on you. But by extending an invitation, you get off to a good start. So more likely that things are gonna go well. So whether it's a question, whether you have some guidelines or ground rules, whether it's an invitation to talk, it's a simple, quick process, but the point is to get off to a good start. And then you want to, from there, after you get off to the good start, you want to have a good conversation. And we want to remember those things that we did, that we learned in kindergarten. Be respectful, be kind, share, use our indoor voice, take our turns, that kind of thing. And so we start off by avoiding the things that stop conversations. And all these, the judging, the name calling, the finger pointing, all those kinds of things, and assuming, the list could go on and on. The things that help attend to the conversation, the deep listening, the reframing, the summarizing, silence, just being respectful with silence. So attending is that thing that you guys are all naturally good at, and you can help others get better at attending by just explaining the importance of that to them. Now the bottom line is we're always negotiating. So real quickly, I just want to hit the 4 basic principles from the Harvard Negotiation Project. The first one being this idea of separate the people from the problem. Because as soon as we start to see the person as the problem, we're making it harder for ourselves. Because if we start to see somebody as evil, crazy, or stupid, who wants to have a conversation with a person like that? And so the idea is, if there's a problem, we want to solve the problem. We want to be hard on the problem, but we want to be kind, humane, and respectful to the human side of the equation. We want to focus on interests instead of positions. We want to invent options for mutual gain. The more we invent, the better. There's actually some brain science that we shift from right brain to left brain, helps to generate ownership and buy-in, which helps agreements to endure. And then we want to look at objective criteria and standards for deciding between this rich list of options. So for parents, crafting a parenting plan, the best interest of their child or their children, kind of the gold standard for objective criteria. Now we also might want to attend that first part. Roger Fisher wrote a book afterwards. The business school, Harvard Business School, really loved the negotiation model, but because they liked the idea of separate the people from the problem, but they just tended to focus on just the problem and ignore the relationship component. So we wrote a book, Getting Together, with a different author, Scott Brown. But he talked about these 6 elements. And the idea is if we pay attention to rationality, understanding, communication, reliability, persuasion, and acceptance, it doesn't matter if the other side doesn't. We are better off. We're going to be better at communicating. We're going to be better at negotiating. We're going to understand the situation more. What we say and do matters more to the other, even if they don't come along. And so for parents, for example, they also get the side benefit of they are modeling really good behavior for their kids. So just this idea that we are always negotiating all the time. And if we negotiate in a principled fashion, we'll have more creative agreements that we can take ownership of and the other side has buy-in into, and those agreements tend to last and endure. So another way of, another visual might be, think of an hourglass. And when you're starting your negotiation conversation, you kind of open it up at the top and you get all this information dumped in. And then you kind of sift it down to what are the issues, what are the motivations, the concerns, the needs. And then you want to kind of open it up by generating a lot of ideas to hit that, bedrock of some kind of mutually agreed upon decision. We covered these earlier, but just, this idea, this is Uri's second book, Getting Past No. How do you, implement getting to yes? Kind of stepping to their side, reframing, building them a bridge, using power to educate. It's all about respect. And so that's, really important. We use negotiation worksheets of all kind at the Mediation Center to help people prepare. Lots of different examples. This is just a PowerPoint version. And then the idea is to shift to a learning stance and have a learning conversation as you go through this process of having these difficult conversations. So with that, we want to thank you very much for your time and attentiveness, and